continue on then with our journey through the Constitution as it was originally written. So I'll be covering some of the amendments later on, but right now we're just doing the Constitution as it was originally written. So last week we started on Article 1, which is the legislative branch or Congress, and that's the biggest article of the Constitution by far. And today I'm going to be talking about Section 7, because we did 1 through 6 last time. And then part of Section 8. We're not going to get through all of Section 8 because that is by far the longest section in Article 1. So it has 18 sections in it. So that's going to take multiple shows to get all the way through that. So last week, again, we covered the first 6 sections of Article 1, which kind of laid out, Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, both. Those sections lay out the qualifications of how you can run for the House and the Senate, the length of terms, right, and how the impeachment process works, and how the House and the Senate can make up their own rules as to how they run their business, as well as some information about elections. So Section 7 is probably best known for the procedure involving the presidential veto. That's the second part of Section 7. Clause 1, however, is the provision that says that all bills, which when they mean bills, are talking about proposed laws, because they're not laws yet. They don't actually become laws until, as we'll talk about with the president, and then presidential veto, they don't become laws until the president signs the bills that pass Congress. So Clause 1 contains a provision in there that says that all bills that involve the raising of revenue, which basically means the raising of taxes, all of those bills have to start in the House of Representatives. Okay, so they cannot start in the Senate. However, once a bill does start in the House, then the Senate can chime in and propose their own if they want, or propose amendments to what the House has done, but it has to start in the House. I think part of the reason here is that, remember in the Constitution, the people were the ones who voted for the House of Representatives members, not the Senate at this point. So the House being the closest House to the people who are going to have their taxes raised, they have to start in the House. So that is Clause 1. So this is why when hopefully we don't see this at the end of September, there might be another partial government shutdown if another budget bill isn't done. Because the federal budget, by the way, starts October 1st and then goes through the end of September. That's why it's not on the December, January timeline. It's actually the end of September and the beginning of October is when it starts. So let's hope we don't have a government shutdown in September. But it has to. The point here is that all of these bills have to start in the House, according to Clause 1 there in Section 7. So if it does not involve revenue, then the Senate can start its own bills too. It just can't do it for taxes. With the one exception of the House also is where impeachment starts. So the Senate cannot start an impeachment because they're the ones that do the ultimate trial if the House does the impeachment. So that's Clause 1. Clause 2 now is where the presidential veto provisions are. So before a bill becomes a law, the president has to sign it. If the president doesn't sign it, then it doesn't become a law. Plus, there's also a common misconception that the president does the laws. The president can say, I want this to be a law, and then, Congress does it and signs it. That's not how it works. Congress needs to pass bills, and then the president needs to sign off on that. One of the exceptions to that is the president doing executive orders as the head of the executive branch. I'll talk about that later when we get to the executive branch. But otherwise, Congress has to propose the bills, and then the president has to sign it. So when during this campaign, when you hear Harris and Trump making all kinds of things that they're saying, this is what I'm going to do if I get elected, so vote for me. Well, oftentimes when they do get elected, Congress doesn't do what the president was running on. They won't let them do it, especially if the opposite party controls the House and or the Senate. Right? So just keep that in mind when you hear the presidential candidates saying what they would do. Well, great, but doesn't mean Congress is going to let you do it. You got to get stuff through Congress. So this is another reason why congressional elections are so important. Because if Harris wins, let's say she wins, but the Republicans keep the House and they win the Senate, she's not going to get hardly anything done because the Republicans aren't going to let her. So this is why you got to vote down ballot for Democrats too, so that we keep the House, keep the Senate in Minnesota legislature, and then that we win the House and keep the Senate at the national level. So if not, Harris might have to at some point sign things like budget bills that favor the Republicans. So make sure you vote Democratic all the way down the ballot. So once Congress passes something, it has to be passed in identical language in both the House and the Senate. Okay, then it gets brought over to the president. The president has basically 4 options. So first, he can sign the bill, and at that point it becomes a law. He has 10 days to do this, so he gets a little bit of time for him, or if it's Trump, he's not going to read it. So it's advisors reading it and telling him to sign it or not. But the president has 10 days to make a decision. So if he signs it, then it becomes a law. Or he can veto it, saying, I disagree with this, and I'm not going to sign it. So I'm actually vetoing it. So once again, he has 10 days to do this, to do the veto or not. So that's the second option. The third option is that the president can do nothing. And then once that 10 days is up and the president has done nothing, but Congress is still in session, then that bill becomes a law under Clause 2 of the Constitution. So that's the third option, where the president can just do nothing. Congress is still in session, the 10 days runs out, and now it becomes a law. So that's the third option. The fourth option is the president does nothing again. So the 10 days runs out, and if Congress is not in session, then it does not become a law. So Congress, if they know that there's an important, piece of legislation for the president to consider, you're not going to see probably Congress adjourn anytime soon when that happens, because they want the president to make a decision. So you don't see that very often, where the Congress just says, "Oh, we're done passing the bill, now we're going to adjourn." Because that leaves open this option where the president just does nothing, Congress is not in session, then it's not a law. The president doesn't even have to veto it then. So those are the 4 options that the president has under Clause 2. So let's assume that the president vetoes the bill. Okay, typically what they do is they say why, like what parts of the bill don't they agree with. And then they send it back to the chamber, meaning either the House or the Senate, that started the bill. So wherever it started, that's where it goes back to, if it is vetoed. So at that point then, Congress can do a couple things if they want to. They can try and override the veto if they got enough support. But they need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to override the veto. Okay, if that doesn't happen, then they can't do it. So it's not a majority vote like it usually does for bills. It's a 2/3 vote you need to override the veto. Or Congress can if it wants to take the objections that the president has and somehow retool the bill. And then it has to repass the House and the Senate both again in the same language, and then they present the new bill to the president, and the president goes through the process again, where he might sign it or he might veto it, or Congress has the option they just do nothing. But the veto then would stand. So another thing that the president can do, although this is not in the Constitution, but you see this happen a lot, where the president, when Congress is negotiating and having debates, if they have debates on stuff, sometimes they get around that. But the president can threaten a veto. So sometimes just by threatening a veto, that can change things in Congress. Sometimes Congress will say, well, it's still fine, they'll make the president veto it. Or sometimes they'll make changes to it to satisfy the president, or sometimes they just drop it because they know they can't override a veto. So sometimes just the threat of a veto is enough to get the president to get Congress to either change things or just to stop because they're wasting their time. So that's clause 2 on the presidential veto. That's the process of it. Clause number 3, and this is the final one in Section 7, says that anything passed by Congress needs to be presented to the president for approval or not, unless it is a motion to adjourn or resolutions that have no force of law. So oftentimes Congress can pass some resolutions that, if it's not, if they're not making it to try and be a law, then they don't have to pass it by the president. But otherwise, you got to run stuff by the president for his approval. So that's Section 7. Section 8, I think, is one of the most important parts of the Constitution and Article 1 because this lays out the powers of Congress. So there are 18 clauses in here. I call this the laundry list because it's so long. And as we'll see, it's missing some key details, which this is something we see throughout the Constitution. Clause 1 starts with taxes. So we talked last time about the Articles of Confederation and how this lack of a taxing power was part of the problem with it. So here, Congress is given the power to collect taxes for paying federal debts, for the common defense, in other words, the military, the national army, and for the general welfare of the United States. Again, welfare here is like just for the general benefit of the people in the United States. It's not like poor people's welfare programs, although that's certainly part of it today. But back then it was just, for the betterment of the people. It also says that taxes have to be uniform throughout the United States. In other words, you can't tax California a lot higher than you do Mississippi, for example. It's got to be the same uniform rates or amounts. Clause 2 allows Congress to borrow money on the credit of the United States. So again, this in the Articles of Confederation, this was a little bit of a problem where Congress didn't have money. So now, under the Constitution, Congress can now borrow money. And they do this oftentimes through the sale of U.S. Treasury bonds, on which they pay some interest on those bonds when they come due. One key thing here, notice that there is no limit on borrowing. So this is one reason why our federal debt oftentimes, is really high, is because there's no limit on what Congress can borrow. So, of course, they borrow a lot of money when they need it. That's a whole other issue about taxes, which I'll talk a little bit about in my next segment. So this is why some people argue for, a constitutional amendment to balance budgets. Well, that's not going to happen, probably. So Clause 3 is on the regulation of commerce. So this was another one of the problems under the Articles of Confederation. Every state had their own commerce, or their own economy, basically. So Congress can now regulate commerce with foreign nations, among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. So what does commerce mean? Well, the Supreme Court has basically said that Congress can regulate interstate commerce, meaning commerce between the states, but not intrastate commerce, which means just commerce inside one state, like Minnesota. So these days, not much commerce is solely within a state anymore, especially with the internet now. So this clause 3 with regulating commerce is a big one that Congress does or uses to do a lot of legislation. And you see battles with people that don't like it are suing, and ultimately the Supreme Court makes some decision on it. So the last one I'm going to cover today is Clause 4 on Congress has the power over naturalization, which means immigration, and also bankruptcy. So, of course, one of the fights going on right now between the states and Congress is on who has control over the immigration laws. Well, under this part of the Constitution, Congress does. But the Supreme Court has allowed some state laws under their police powers. That's in the 10th Amendment, which I'll cover later. And normally what you see is the border states and the states controlled by the Republicans are the ones trying to have extra laws about immigration to try and cut it down. So this is one of the fights between the feds and the states oftentimes. But under this, in Clause 4 here, the Congress has the authority over immigration and naturalization. All right, so next week we will continue on this section